What do you get when you put three brothers together in mid-century Indiana? Chaos. Or maybe comedy. Or, if you ask my grandmother Mildred, a special place in heaven reserved just for mothers of three boys. This is the story of Clarence's sons, Mark, Jeffrey, and Greg. My dad, my uncle, and their big brother. The planner, the executor, and the instigator. And like these three walls I'm gluing together today, they were nothing alike. But when they leaned against each other, somehow they managed to stand. Welcome to Museum of the Ancestors, where I build miniature spaces to tell life-sized family stories. Each room, each wall, each tiny detail is made for remembering, for holding on to the people who came before me. This project belongs to my grandfather, Clarence, a Navy Seabee, a carpenter, and a man full of wit and contradictions. His shed is slowly rising here in miniature, one board at a time, and with it rise the stories that shaped the family he left behind. And these stories, more often than not, involve his three sons. My dad, Mark, Dad's younger brother, Jeffrey, I call him UJ, a nod back to the movie Uncle Buck, and their older brother, Greg. Three boys who could not have been more different, but who together made a kind of wonderful, exhausting chaos. They teased each other in the way that only brothers can. UJ and Greg used to call my dad Milk, because it absolutely drove him crazy. And decades later, when I was well into my 30s, Jeffrey let me in on the secret. Of course, the first thing I did was call my dad Milk. And just like when he was 10 years old, it still irritated him. That's the thing about brothers. Some bonds are sticky, some are silly, and some annoyances never quite fade away. Here's where the shed finally starts taking shape. Three walls joined with glue, making something sturdier than they ever could be alone. Now I'm using these three walls to measure out the space for the hardwood floor. And this is where I admit I'm not much of a measurer. I eyeball things, I guess. I hope for the best. But while I'm tracing these lines, I can't help but think about trees. Because trees were something Clarence loved deeply, and he passed that love to my dad, and my dad passed it on to me. Indiana trees in late summer have a presence you don't forget. The heavy green canopy holding on just a little longer before the turning of the seasons. The cicadas buzzing like the sound of electricity in the air. That dry rustle of leaves makes you feel like the world is both alive and ready to rest. When I was in 9th grade in Indianapolis, I had to do a biology project where we pressed and identified at least 50 leaves. Dad knew exactly where to take me. Crown Hill Cemetery, where the trees are labeled and the paths wind under some of the grandest old specimens in the state. He didn't need the labels, of course. By then, he was a genius at plant identification, a skill he had honed in college with his natural resources degree, but really, it came from Clarence, from walking fields and fence rows, from noticing. That day was hot. The kind of August heat that wraps itself around you and won't let go. We walked slowly under the shade, and Dad pointed out trees as if he were introducing me to his old friends. Oak, sycamore, tulip poplar, hickory. We talked about plants, about school, about life. And all around us the cicadas sang, the leaves whispered overhead, and the gravestones stood like witnesses to it all. It's one of those afternoons you never forget. The kind that etches itself into your senses. Even now, when I'm out in nature, I listen for that same rustle of leaves, that chorus of sound. It's healing, in a way, a reminder that life endures, season after season. Now it's time for the floor. I start by cutting a piece of foam board, using the pattern I made by tracing around the inside edges of three walls. That gives me the footprint of the shed. Next comes the sticky part, literally. I cover the foam board with double-sided carpet tape. That gives me a surface to press the floorboards onto. Mildred used to shake her head and say, "1 boy is fine, 2 is trouble, but 3 is chaos." And she wasn't wrong. It feels a little poetic because Clarence and Mildred's 3 boys were exactly like that. My dad, Mark, was the one who came up with the plans, the planner. Jeffrey, 2 years younger, was the one who carried them out, the executor. And Greg, the oldest, was usually the one who got the whole thing started, the instigator. Neither Dad nor UJ talked much about how Clarence handled the chaos of 3 boys, but I can imagine it must have been stressful for him. From what I've been told, Clarence could be unpredictable. Something that didn't bother him 1 week might send him into a fury the next. That kind of volatility probably kept the boys guessing, sometimes laughing and sometimes ducking for cover. All 3 of them, Dad, UJ, and even Greg, always referred to Clarence as the old man. And I've thought about that a lot. Was it just a mid-century central Indiana thing, the way kids talked back then about their fathers? Or did it carry a sharper edge, a kind of wary respect for a man whose moods were hard to pin down? My mom and her brothers never once called their father the old man. To them, he was always Dad. So hearing that phrase attached to Clarence makes me pause. Was it affection disguised as exasperation? Or exasperation disguised as affection? Maybe it was both. Families are complicated like that. But here's the thing. Unpredictable as he was, Clarence was still the glue that held those 3 boys together. The one they measured themselves against, even when they didn't agree with him. The one whose truck, trees, and temper became the backdrop of their adventures. Just like these walls, leaning against each other for strength, his sons leaned against the presence, and sometimes the shadow, of the old man. And maybe that's why this next story stays with me so much. Because before my dad loved trees, he had to learn the hard way, with a coffee can of gasoline, a flash of fire, and a set of singed branches that nearly drove Clarence out of his mind. So here's the story. My dad, Mark, was curious. He wanted to know if it was the liquid gasoline that burned or if it was just the fumes. And curiosity plus access to Clarence's gas truck from the Farm Bureau Co-op? Yeah, that was a recipe for trouble. Dad marched right out to the truck with a coffee can, filled it with gasoline, and carried it off a safe distance, or what he thought was a safe distance, and then he struck a match. Whoosh! The whole thing went up in a rush of fire, a blaze that lit the branches of the tree, like a flashbulb going off in the sky. It was over in seconds, but the evidence was unmistakable. Scorched leaves, singed bark, and the faint smell of smoke hanging in the air. Now, I should say, this wasn't his first questionable experiment. Back in my Mildred's Greenhouse series, I told the story about how Dad tested whether cats land on their feet. And yes, the cat landed, and yes, Dad got scratched. I'll put a link in the description if you would like to see that one. He was a sciencey kid, always experimenting, always wanting to know why things happened. And Clarence? Clarence was apoplectic. Now, apoplectic is one of those words that doesn't get enough use anymore. It means absolutely furious, blood pressure rising, steam coming out of your ears, mad. And if you can picture a man who spent his life driving gas trucks and tree surgeoning, suddenly confronted with his son lighting a coffee can of gasoline under one of his beloved branches, well, you can probably imagine the look on his face. But here's the funny part. Clarence wasn't worked up over the wasted gasoline. He wasn't even most upset that Dad could have gotten hurt or blown the place sky high. No. What really set him off was the tree, the singed branches, the scar left behind on something living that he valued far more than a can of fuel. And that's the part that stuck with Dad. His respect for trees wasn't learned in a classroom. It was seared into him that day, passed down from Clarence, passed on to me, and still carried forward in every rustle of leaves I listened for. Of course, Clarence's temper didn't stop the chaos. If anything, it just made the boys more creative. And the next story proves it. because when Greg had an idea about their old Plymouth and the swing set in the yard, Mark and Jeffrey couldn't resist turning it into an experiment of their own. Let's lay the floorboards. I decided to get a little fancy here and go with a herringbone pattern. The only problem is my propensity for not measuring gets me into trouble again. Some of the boards come out too long, leaving gaps. Others are too short, which forces me to sand and trim them into place. Where the cracks are too wide, I sneak in little scraps of wood or fill them with the same mixture I use to seal up the wall seams. It's a floor. Crooked and patched, but still a floor. And it reminds me a lot of my dad and his brothers because they weren't so good at measuring either, especially when Greg had the bright idea that their old Plymouth could fit under the A-frame swing set in the yard. Now this Plymouth wasn't a sleek little car. This was a big 1950s hunk of Detroit steel, the kind of car that could probably survive a tornado, but not necessarily an A-frame. The idea, of course, came from Greg, the instigator. He was convinced the Plymouth would slide right through, no problem. Like threading a needle, except with a 2-ton automobile. Keys? They didn't have keys. But Dad had watched Clarence push-start cars before, so the plan was hatched. Greg and Jeffrey pushed with all their might, Dad steered, and when the time was right, he popped the clutch. To their amazement, it worked. The car coughed, lurched, and roared to life, shuddering down the yard like a beast set free. And then came the moment of truth. The swing set loomed ahead, green metal frame, waiting like a gate of destiny. Greg was hollering, "It'll fit! Keep going!" Jeffrey was probably half laughing, half terrified. And Dad, ever the planner, had already committed. Except nobody had actually done the math. The Plymouth did not pass under the swing set. It passed into it. With a tremendous metallic clang and the roof wedged tight against the bar, the car's front end sticking out on one side, its tail end trapped on the other, wheels spun uselessly in the grass. The swings themselves, which Jeffrey had carefully moved to the side before starting this project, were rattling and clanking like church bells announcing the disaster. And there they were. 3 boys, 1 car, and a swing set now permanently redesigned into a carport. And Clarence? Clarence was apoplectic all over again. The lecture this time must have been spectacular. Clarence wasn't mad about reckless endangerment. No, he was mad about the headache, the expense of fixing the car, the sheer pain in the butt of figuring out how to unwedge a Plymouth from an A-frame swing set without destroying both. That was the kind of fury the Brown boys grew up with. The chaos was theirs, but the cleanup always fell to him. And maybe that's why this one stuck with my dad the most. Because after that day, he became a measure twice, cut once kind of man. It's a lesson you don't forget when the cost of miscalculation comes in bent metal and your father's voice booming across the yard. Laying these tiny floorboards feels a lot like these stories. Some pieces too long, some too short, gaps that have to be filled with scraps and glue. Nothing perfectly measured, nothing seamless. But here's the thing, the floor still holds. The car may have been stuck, but the brothers survived and the lesson stuck too. Perfection isn't what makes something stand. Sometimes it's the patched up bits, the ridiculous failures, the chaos you live through and laugh about later. That's what gives it strength. That's what keeps it standing. Staining a floor takes time. You dip the brush, drag it across the boards, and watch as the wood darkens, each piece drinking in the color in its own way. Some boards take the stain deeply, richly, like they were waiting for it. Others resist, turning only a shade darker, as if reluctant to change. That's how it was with Clarence and Mildred's 3 sons. Greg, the oldest, set out first. He went to Vincennes, then Indianapolis. He had his own way of moving through the world, sharp-edged, untethered. He teased Jeffrey mercilessly as a boy, and once they grew up and parted ways, that was it. No looking back. Like a board cut on the bias, he no longer lined up with the others. Jeffrey's road stretched farther, Nebraska and then Minnesota. He wasn't especially close to his brothers after that. But after he and I found each other, by the time I was in my 20s, we were friends, and we've been friends ever since. He and Mark spoke now and then, but not the way he and I did. In the absence of his brothers, he became mine. And Mark, my dad, he started closer to the center, Indianapolis, and then farther afield in Tennessee. He was the one who carried Clarence's love of trees, who passed down lessons of nature and care, who gave me memories I return to even now. They weren't especially close, the three of them. Childhood chaos burned hot, and then it burned out. They scattered like boards laid at angles, pointing in different directions. And yet, when you stain a floor, all these boards, long or short, light or dark, still end up joined together. Pressed side by side, they make something you can stand on. Even if they don't match, even if the gaps show, they still belong to the same floor. That's how I think of these three brothers. Not aligned, not harmonious, but forever part of the same grain. As I stain these tiny floorboards, I find myself thinking about Indiana's seasons. Summer's heavy with green canopies, cicadas buzzing like power lines, the air thick enough to drink. Autumn's crisp and golden, with the smell of wood smoke threading through the air. Winter's sharp and gray, the kind of cold that makes you grateful for a squeaky floorboard and a warm stove. And spring, muddy and bright, full of promise, full of birdsong. This was the rhythm of life in Muncie, Indiana, where Clarence and Mildred raised their boys, a place the sociologists once called Middletown, because they thought it was the most average American city imaginable. And yet, others called it Little Chicago because of the crime, the roughness under the surface. Average and gritty, ordinary and dangerous, all at once. It was there in the 1950s and 60s that Mark and Jeffrey and Greg came of age. A time of cars and swing sets, gas trucks and tree-lined streets. Of boys restless in summer heat, looking for something to do, looking for trouble, looking for experiments that would become family legend. Greg the oldest, the instigator, always pushing first, sharp-edged and quick to break away. Jeffrey the youngest, the executor, willing to carry out the plan even if it was doomed to get them in trouble. And Mark, my dad, the planner, the one who dreamed up schemes and later carried their lessons forward. And even now when I hear the cicadas buzz or the rustle of leaves in late summer, it brings it all back to me. Not just the stories, but the feeling of those ordinary days, the way the air sounded, the way the seasons wrapped around our lives. These are everyday comforts, these little echoes of place and time that keep a family's story alive. The chaos of three brothers, the unpredictability of Clarence, the steadiness of Mildred. All of it carried on the wind through the leaves. And maybe that's the real gift of building something like this. A miniature floor, a crooked shed, a story retold. It's a way of listening again for those ordinary sounds and finding comfort in the fact that they're still here. Thank you for being here with me, for listening, for standing in the sawdust and the stories right alongside me. If this is your first time at Museum of the Ancestors, I hope you'll wander back through the earlier videos. There's a whole nother greenhouse and plenty more chaos from Clarence and Mildred's world waiting there. And if you've been here from the beginning, thank you. You're part of what keeps me going, what holds this whole project together. I would love to hear from you too. Share a memory of your own brothers or sisters, or maybe a cousin or childhood friend who brought a little chaos into your story. Those everyday comforts, those ordinary adventures, are what make life worth remembering. Until next time, the floor is laid, the story is told, and the shed, like the memories, stands a little bit taller.